Wow, that got real quiet real quick. Wow. Let's see. Avoid talking right into this. So, like they said, we talked about digital Hapkido, which is going to be primarily adversary interruption and obstruction. I have the obligatory I love me slide up here, so you guys can take a look at a little bit of my background. I've been doing cybersecurity for a couple decades now, and so it's one of those things that I'll try to avoid, saying something along the lines of, back in my day. But one of the neat things by presenting to SecDSM, has its benefits to where a lot of the talks that I do, I have to explain what DEF CON is, and I don't have to do that for this particular crowd, but it's always kind of fun to where it's like trying to say, well, you've got Las Vegas, which is known for its great decision making, and then you take a bunch of hackers, you put them in Las Vegas and add a bunch of alcohol and let the magic just happen. But it's one of those fun things. I feel bad for anyone who is attending Vegas during DEF CON that isn't there for DEF CON, in for a rough ride. Then it's nice here that we have people up in the front row, so I don't get to make my Gallagher joke a lot of times. It's fine, there's no splash zone, it'll be good. Those who don't know me, I tend to be fairly caffeinated, so I speak fairly quickly, and I apologize for that. If I start going too fast, just kind of raise your hand, let me know. Keep this interactive. I like to, questions as we're going through, make it, fun for everyone. So here at SecDSM, like they had mentioned, you guys have acquired some black badges, and so I decided to bring in some pieces of history that you may or may not have seen over your time here in technology. So in the early days of DEF CON, for winning the CTF competition, it wasn't always a black badge. It used to be you get money and VMware licenses because VMware was pretty tied into how the competition was run then. We won DEF CON, the CTF, and DEF CON 9, DEF CON 10, and some of Interzone. And it was really neat. A group called the Ghetto Hackers was running DEF CON. And they had some unique perspectives on what prizes would look like. So one of the prizes that we got in DEF CON 10, and it started somewhat sarcastically talking to Dee Dee, but some lines of the, well, what do you want, a weight belt? Well, yeah, it's like a championship kind of belt if you win. I'm like, yeah, that'd be kind of nice. So they followed through on this, and that was kind of neat. And then when we won Interzone, they upped the game a little bit at Interzone, which is a conference that no longer exists. And they gave us a scimitar, a big, huge, full-length, real-life scimitar that was engraved with Interzone and CTF winners. Yeah, good luck getting that through TSA. So that is what some of our other members that we have that were driving to DEF CON or Interzone at the time. And then I can officially say, like I said, I'm an old hacker. So one of the things that some of the older groups like Ghetto Hackers and even some like the Net Ninjas, we decided that as DEF CON grew, it got a little large, and it wasn't really what we remember. You kind of lost that sense of community, which is one of the things I really like with SecDSM here is, everyone is helping each other out. It reminds me of some of the earlier days of DEF CON, and it's really, that pure sense of security where you guys are learning from each other, all walks, all different layers of interest. However, like I said, I'm old, so I've now belonged to, it's a DEF CON club that they have started called Shady Oaks Hacker Retirement Community. We got cards and everything. And normally they spring up like a suite with something, and then they have these coasters in here with those of us who remember the floppy disks with the Shady Oaks logo. I guess for the camera over here. I got to make sure to, since we're live streaming it, look over this way and not. I tend to, normally my presentations kind of wander around, but I'm going to have to tether myself to here. Hopefully I don't whack the microphone. I tend to speak with my hands. Those you might find some of my pictures on Twitter where it's like a Horatio moment, like I'm talking to a skull or something. So the agenda of what we're going to be going through today are some key foundational tenets that I believe that I want to make sure I can articulate, because lots of things that go around the security community, and I've been doing this a long time now, watching a lot of things go full circle, and certain things that get said kind of start to irritate me, and so since this is my platform, I can kind of talk a little bit about that. And this next one here sounds a little self-serving with the kind of hierarchy of needs. It's very much, you'll see later on, based off Maslow's ladder of hierarchy of needs. I found myself repeating a lot of key concepts at a lot of the talks I was giving. And so I put it in a slide so that it could be better consumed, because one of the things, just like security frameworks, everyone's at different journeys in their companies, in their careers, or what their roles are. And my goal is, as I give these presentations, to give something that someone can take away regardless of what their role is within their organization or what they do, or how large their organization is, or depending on their level of executive backing. And also laying some groundwork on, those of you who are not familiar necessarily with the cyber kill chain, anatomy attacks, the MITRE attack framework, and then we get into the meat and potatoes of the talk towards the end of the adversary obstruction, some cyber deception. And we're going to kind of skip over the conversation and questions because, nothing says fun like trying to do a live demo in front of a technical audience. But I got in the habit of starting to do that. Although since we're streaming, what I'm going to do is I recorded the demo, so I'm going to play the recording. That way, on the off chance, the demo goes horribly awry, you guys at least get something. We just kind of edit that latter part out. What I'm going to be demoing tonight is, so you may have seen the bad USB cables, and one of the guys, O.MG, came out with the O.MG cable on there, which is the next generation of that, of the horror that is it looks like an Apple cable or an iPhone cable, but it's really not. In fact, I'll hold it up when we do the demo, but I've got a legitimate iPhone cable here and one of the O.MG cables. And I left the blue tabs on them because you really can't tell these things apart, besides the fact that the blue one's all nice and weaponized. But we'll go over that later on in the talk. So here are some of my key foundational tenets that I believe in. And I've worked at Walmart Blue Cross Blue Shield now for 17 years-ish, maybe a little more. Time gets kind of fuzzy as you work in industry. So I found that we've done a lot of things at our company, and it's not because we've had huge wins, but the fact that we keep moving the ball forward and we win through attrition. And so, you don't always win every battle, but if you can keep moving your initiatives forward to make things more and more and more secure, eventually you'll arrive at your end goal if you can just outlast what's going on in your organization. And the thing that why I put it in bold and underline it, because I get sick to death in these presentations when I hear that breaches are inevitable. And I'm a firm believer that they are not inevitable, but the control failures are inevitable. However, a lot of organizations don't have the real defense in depth or their tiered control structures or the response capability to respond to some of these actors, so those actors, that will lead to a breach. And I believe that if you have enough time, have enough executive backing as you're working through your organization, you can build out that defense in depth over time to prevent that event or control failure from becoming an incident or a breach. And I'll talk more about that in some of the adversary obstruction concepts later on. And one of the primary things is, I'll talk a lot about not just shiny technology or things that, buy multi-million-dollar pieces of hardware to help save you from the nation states, but things that you can leverage that won't cost you a dime, and you just probably, haven't thought about it, of, the home field advantage. I mean, you should know your network better than any nation-state Russian hacker that happens to be breaking in on a drive-by or going through. And so how you leverage that knowledge through the adversary obstruction, which I'll get into later, to make sure that you can punish those attackers in your network. And then I'm also, and this is one of those things over time, I used to never be a fan of metrics because in security, a lot of times the metrics are very qualitative. It's like, well, I feel secure, but how do I demonstrate that to like a board? And there are some quantitative metrics that you can use, and especially once you start maturing your security discipline, it's important to inspect what you expect. And I can also offer you some metrics later on. So for those of you who have to produce metrics, I can help you out. And good security doesn't have to be expensive. Again, I like FireEye. I talk to them. We work with Mandiant and FireEye. But at the end of the day, a lot of times, especially management, can be very product focused. And really, it's the people that make the difference. And it doesn't have to be expensive. Not saying that I'm not opposed to spending some money to make your lives better. But at the end of the day, you can really do a very good security program on a shoestring budget with the right level of executive backing, time, and materials. And then when I talk about the kill chain, those of you, the song really fundamentally hasn't changed, but the dances is the same. So when you look at what's happening, like with ransomware or with the nation states or like APT-19 or any of the ones you read about in the news, how they go about compromising a system, the steps are still there. And we can debate, well, they skipped this step over here, so they don't really have that step. But fundamentally, the kill chain is very sound. And so you start looking at where you can start interrupting that. It makes it to where you can achieve your security objectives without necessarily having to be perfect all the time. And then my personal favorite is, and again, benefit of talking to SecDSM, because you guys get this, compliance does not equal security. And one of the examples I use, just because everyone tends to understand it very well, is with the target breach and walking through, because shortly after they were certified in their compliance statement is when the bad things started happening in their organization. That being said, on we go. So this is my self-serving kind of hierarchy of needs, just because one of the things that, much like with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I'm not saying you can't achieve the upper tier, like the adaptive securities, unlike with the hierarchy of needs that Maslow did, without having the other tier built. But to achieve a very solid security program, you need to build off that sound foundation. And some of these are not even technical. It's just understanding like what your business tolerance for risk is. If you work in an organization that just says, we're just about getting product to market. If we get popped, that's okay. It's going to make your job a lot harder, but at least understanding that will give you, where you need and your starting points are in securing that organization. And then as you build off of that through your asset management, all the way up to what I consider kind of the fun stuff in threat intelligence and threat hunting. And I joke a lot of times, and I probably shouldn't, but I'm the director of the cybersecurity operations group. So we have threat intelligence, we have digital forensics, threat and vulnerability management, data loss, and I like to say the fun side of security versus identity and access management. Not saying that can't be fun. It's just when you start getting into what I find where you have a pulse on what's going on, it tends to be in more that offensive defensive side, and like with our SOC and cyber incident response. So the kill chain, for those of you who haven't seen it, the steps are, as you go through reconnaissance all the way through the actor acting on objectives. And much like with the software development lifecycle, the far left, the earlier left you can get, is software development, the cheaper it is to fix bugs. In the cyber kill chain, the earlier left that you can get and interrupt the adversary, and within there, the less damaging is going to be necessarily costly to the organization, because typically, and this is very sad, but you look at a lot of organizations and dwell time within these organizations is still abysmal. You're talking, tens, hundreds of days before these attackers are being detected in these networks. And this is one of the things that I think we can do a lot better on, back into knowing your environment and putting in low-cost security to kind of get a pulse on what's going on to make sure that you know your environment better than the attacker does. And then we'll get into some of these different areas at different points in the kill chain to where you can either interrupt the adversary and stop them before they get to the acting on objectives, which is typically making off with your data, encrypting your data, or doing whatnot. I took this quote from a conference which I would suggest that you go to. However, I would say be prepared that it is very expensive, unfortunately. They hold it in Miami, Florida. It's called Infiltrate. And it's kind of what DEF CON used to be. I would say like DEF CON grown up. Because when you go there, they restrict the attendance to something like 300 or 400 people. And it's held at this very swanky hotel that's right on the beach that, again, is stupid expensive. So the conference tickets themselves aren't cheap, aren't expensive, but the hotel is just ridiculous when you're out there. But the type of the talks that you're going to go into, they have one track, there's no vendors, and it's, I would say, the who's who in the industry, but it gets back to what DEF CON used to be about pioneering security research and, talking about what your adversaries are actually doing in these nation states, with one exception. It feels like DEF CON of old until like the coffee break happens. And so then all of a sudden you've got these people who are, not dressed in suits. I mean, it's standard DEF CON fare, t-shirts and whatnot, hoodies. But then they start wheeling in the fancy Italian espresso bars and all these things. It's like, oh, hackers grown up with real jobs and lots of money, because here it comes. I mean, wheeling this all in, and then like when their meals is not like, oh, we're gonna have pizza and beer. It's like, no, they're flying chefs in. It's like, well, it's a different experience. But again, from a technology perspective, it's there. I mean, during the talk last year at Infiltrate, I think they dropped 4 or 5 0 days. In fact, one of the guys that was doing a talk on iOS, flying over from China, he was talking about weaponizing a jailbreak for iOS and gaining persistence. And they submit the talk, and they do a great job of vetting out, making sure that these are solid presentations. But he perfected the exploit on the plane ride over from China. So he was dropping this exploit at the talk. So it was kind of neat. But again, understanding your adversaries, because I know a lot of times when we talk to management, you get these nation-state threat actors. And realistically, a lot of hacking is just spending more time than people really think that you're going to spend to solve a problem. So I'm also a big believer in pictures are worth 1,000 words. So when you present a story to, whenever you're trying to achieve an objective, whether it's to get security funding, implement a tool, implement a process, or secure your organization, you have to figure out who you're talking to and what pictures will really resonate with them. And so whether it's the board of directors or your peers in the industry, there's all sorts of fun ways you can represent the same facts. So I threw together this, representation here for Target, for the anatomy of attack, and we do a lot of this for our board of directors when threats are affecting our organization or there's things that are in the news. And I'll show a kind of an example of our later one. This one here is something that we would typically more do to like a group like SecDSM or a group of our peers, because it's like, it has some kind of fun graphics. But materially, what I want to get into when I talk about where you can interrupt the adversary is going to be in this slide here because it works really well on the timeline. So I'd mentioned earlier on, again, back into compliance does not equal security. So look at the far left, Target was certified PCI DSS compliant, and then shortly thereafter is when the attackers start stealing credentials and start working in their network. And right there in November of 2013, the attackers first kind of breached the target network. This is when they've crossed the gate and they're in the network and they start to test their malware on the point-of-sale systems within Target. And you'll see, and this wasn't intentional because I didn't know FireEye was sponsoring this at the time. But in November, shortly thereafter, FireEye was triggering alerts in their network. And that wasn't the only thing that was signaling them that they had a problem on the wire. But Symantec had also, again, this isn't a product demo. I mean, really, I kind of hate all AV vendors equally. I won't get into where we use, but they all kind of, depends on how you use them. So the point is that this is where the adversary was really starting to laterally move and starting to act on objectives and figure out what's going on and what they can do with it. And they had the proper alerts, but those alerts went unheeded. So if you could imagine the different story it would have been in what we know now about the Target breach, had someone stopped them there, completely different story. However, the attack goes, I would say unnoticed, but there are alerts, but they didn't act on that, so the attacker starts extending their sphere of influence. And they upgrade the malware that they're using on the point-of-sale system that they're eventually going to use to exfiltrate the data. And yet again, more alerts were fired that went unheeded. So even at this point, while yes, it would have been damaging, it's still, the attackers really haven't made off with the data yet. So from an impact to the organization, if they would have stopped them there, would have been much better off. And this is the sad thing of it's never a good day when you're like knock on the door and the DOJ is like, hey, you guys got a problem. Any of the three-letter agencies coming to pay you a visit spontaneously is not a good thing. And so after they were notified in December, then Target confirms the breach, and the attackers lost their foothold in the network. But you see they operated within the environment, I don't want to say with impunity, for a fairly long time. And I don't want to pick on the Target employees, the security folks unnecessarily, but when it gets into, what was the circumstances and why they didn't act on those, and had they had some better adversary obstruction or interruption techniques, it would have been a completely different story, as it was reported into the news. One of the things that's near and dear to my heart, because you're not only impacted in your organizations by what's happening technically, but also legislatively, typically. I work for a healthcare organization, so HIPAA is a big thing for us. And one of the unintended consequences when the ACA came into being was good intention. They wanted to make it easier for providers to register to get like electronic funds. On the flip side, the mandated attributes that they gave us to allow the providers to register are freely available on the internet from the government's website. So yeah, that was a neat idea. You know, it's one of those things that I won't pick on like the IEEE or policymakers, but you know, smart people do dumb things sometimes, and this just happened to be, you know, unintended consequences. So when you look at what started happening is attackers started registering as these fraudulent providers because they had all the information. And when you work in organizations, you know, people want speed to market, ease of use. And so in a lot of these healthcare payers that started to see an issue is the hacker would register as a provider and say, here's my electronic funds information, please transfer all this, you know, information into this account, enter. And when the billing system picked up and said, oh, that's cool, this provider just signed up for EFTs, we can stop shipping them checks. Awesome, let's start paying this. No notification typically that, hey, we just changed your payment information, no calls were made. Things just happened automatically in these downstream systems. And then what eventually started happening was the providers were like, hey, we like getting paid, what happened? Like, well, we've been paying you. And by that time, as you guys know with EFT, you know, you typically have 24, 48 hours or so to really start trying to claw this stuff back, or it's gone. So there was millions and millions of dollars lost in a lot of larger healthcare organizations. Fortunately, you know, we were not part of that problem because we have some checks and balances. We have a lot of partnerships that we work with within our organization outside of even IT, like our finance department. So we've been kind of tracking that this could have been a problem, so we'd implemented some manual steps just as a check and balance if any of these carriers like, wow, we've been doing business with you. Walmart's been around for like 80 years, and all of a sudden, you know, we've been paying you out of this one account for 50 years, and all of a sudden, you know, this just changed. Like, actually pick up the phone and call my contact over there to make sure that that's all legitimate. So I understand that in organizations, we don't have infinite scale or infinite resources. As you know, cybersecurity, it's hard to hire, you know, good professionals. So I think, you know, wherever you can leverage free resources, the better. So when you look at adversary emulation and saying, well, I don't have, you know, a threat intelligence department, I can't go leverage this information, where do I go to help me out so I can make sure that I'm doing what I need to protect my organization? The MITRE ATT&CK framework is phenomenal, and the website is great and it's well maintained, and you can go out there so that way you don't have to have, you know, a fully staffed threat intelligence arm to start saying, well, how do I have to worry about this nation state threat actor or this type of a threat that may be facing my organization? When you go out to MITRE, and let's see, this is very hard to read. You'll want to pull down the slides or look at the video later on, or just go to the website yourself, because talking about the kill chain, everything far left from the reconnaissance perspective before you really get to the far right acting on objectives, you can click on any one of these boxes. And within the box itself, like a drive-by compromise, it talks in words that you can give your executive, you know, leadership of, well, this is what this is and why we need to be concerned. And then it gives you examples of, here's the type of threat actors that are actively using these types of techniques. And my personal favorite, here's also some sample mitigation techniques that you can use to help protect your organization. So if on some of these attack techniques you're like, yeah, I know what server-side request forgery is, but you know, I have a hard time talking to my developers about how they protect against this, you're not alone. You can then leverage these resources to help you explain to whomever at whatever technical level and within your organization, you know, to better your defenses. That being said, we have now laid the groundwork, and I get to talk about our fun topic of tonight, which is adversary obstruction. To do this, I enlisted the help of my daughter because I can't draw at all. So, you know, not everyone's good at everything, and you do not want me on your team in Pictionary. So what we have here is, you know, what I think is the ability to flip the script. So from a blue team perspective, you always hear, you know, well, we have to be right all the time, and hackers just have to be right, you know, once. You know, that's not entirely true. When you get into it, I think the blue team, realistically, when you get down to it, you need to play to a draw. And you're just getting there so the attacker does not win. You don't have to win, but you have to make sure that they don't win either. So there was a fun video, I think it's still floating around the internet because the internet has a long memory, of where you've got this chicken playing tic-tac-toe at a carnival. And it's just raking in money for people because people are like, I will, you know, put $1 and try to beat the chicken, take your dollar, take your dollar, take your dollar. Because again, there's only a finite subset of moves, and I want to say the chicken, you know, just is not trying to win, just trying not to lose. So when you start leveraging fun technologies like AI, robotic process automation, or all these kind of fun buzzwords, at the end of the day, when I start thinking, I'm not saying it can't be mature, and I've heard some really kind of fun things. We could get into talking about, like, we've got these AI bots calling our customer service lines, and I can get into that story later on. But, as it relates into how that leverages with our blue team, from a perspective of leveraging that, instead of, not saying that our blue team is the chicken in the scenario, but saying, can I put a bot in there to hit the stuff that I know where all the movesets are to interrupt the adversary faster? And what I mean by that is making sure that I have layers to prepare for control failures. Because our friend, the OSI model, has 7 layers, but we always add layer 8, which is the human, and invariably that was typically the layer that will fail most often. So, strengthen up your security awareness programs. But what you need to plan for is walk through, and this is where, like, your red team scenarios or the MITRE ATT&CK framework will help you fill this out where this works in your organization. And this is where you have to start taking what I'm going to give you and personalize it, just like a security framework for your own organization, to find out what works for you. Because just because of certain things that I'll talk about at the very end of the presentation work for us, we've been doing a lot of this, building this slowly up over time, 10, 15 years. So you probably are not going to be able to then execute this in your organization very, very quickly, but there are little tidbits you can start doing depending on your organization. But it really allows the blue team to flip the script and say, if I focus in not having to be constantly perfect, are there areas where I can then say, if I see these types of things, I can stop the adversary before they can start acting on their objectives, like making off with data. And a lot of times when you start thinking about this, especially outside of the box, some of these are going to be extremely no cost or low cost in your environment. But I will talk about, if you want to go buy something, here's some free and open source solutions you can use. Or in some organizations, they're not a huge fan of using free and open source solutions. So here are some very no cost or low cost solutions that you can implement that can be very effective depending upon your organization. But the key to a lot of these is making sure that these should be very high fidelity things that you're doing. Like, one of the examples I will talk about here is where you can go with deception later on. And a lot of it, like segmentation, base security concepts that aren't new, that we've talked about for ages, saying, treat your user LAN as hostile, or these types of machines should never talk to these other types of machines. So if they do, this is one of those key indicators that maybe an attacker is trying to move laterally in your environment. So find key things that make sense for you, or if you've got a sales organization that should never talk to this branch of servers. If they do, maybe that might be a problem. Or leveraging things now with technology as it advanced. In the earlier days, in a wired network, you had to really go to extremes like private VLANs and some of the access control lists on the switch you're doing to segment off the users. If you go to wireless, it's a checkbox now. AP isolation, sure, no one can talk to each other. And then what you can start doing is looking to see, is someone trying to talk to someone else? That might be indicative of a problem. Another thing that, we start looking at, some of these seem very, very obvious, but like volume of traffic. There was a well-known instance where I believe it was NASA had, lost gigs and gigs of data to China. And this happened over months. And at some point you have to ask the question of, didn't someone think that you've got this connection that's been going on for like 3 months to China? Maybe someone might want to take a look at what's going on with that connection. In your environment, know your data patterns. For us, we have certain times that are busier than others during the times of the month, so we're going to see spikes in traffic. But be able to then suss out those anomalies and be able to then act on it. So it's not be a matter of just being identifying, but have the run books set up to what happens when we do. It may be you've got Tim over here, he's going to run in there and then unplug the internet from the data closet. Whatever it may be, just know what your adversary steps are so that when you're reacting to this, you're not doing it in the heat of the moment, but you've got something that's well defined that you can also communicate upstream, so that way you don't have the heat from management saying, so let me get this straight, Tim, you unplugged the internet. Why, yes, because we had this thing happen and we had this agreed upon action that we were going to do this to minimize the damage. And then one of my personal favorites is, and this can be a little bit more complex depending upon if you're in a kind of bring your own device network, But in our shop, primarily, we're very much Windows on the desktop. Now, in our environment, that consists of what we call, they don't like when I call them toasters, thin clients. So thin clients that are non-persistent that we stream applications to. And those are all Windows devices. So if I start seeing something happening on, say, this network that should only contain, like, oh, why did a Mac just show up on my Windows-only device network? That's a problem. Or like I'll talk a little bit later about keyboard layouts, my personal favorite for us, if I see like a Russian keyboard layout show up in like RDP, that's an issue. I mean, while we do some overseas work and how we bring that in, we bring everything in to specific connections. And so, I should have that fairly well defined. These don't have to be super, super, super complex. One of the things that we found really paid back dividends over time was we're an Iowa and South Dakota company. So the Blue Cross Blue Shield organization, we pass things back and forth through our sister plans, but realistically, we have nothing international. So we sat back and said, why do we even accept traffic from overseas? So we cut that traffic off. And you want to see a significant traffic, dip in what your IDSs and systems are seeing, start doing that. And of course, you get the argument, well, Russia or Ukraine will. I shouldn't have said that. We'll just compromise a U.S.-based company and come through them, or they're just going to use a VPN service and come through that VPN service. Sure, they can do that, but that's an additional step that a lot of these different organizations don't have as a barrier for them to be attacked. So anything, again, back to defense and layers. What can I do to keep layering controls to protect our organization, but not necessarily putting all of our eggs in one basket and relying on one of those controls. But by doing that, I mean, the thing that we saw the biggest impact on is executives traveling. So this gets back into like understanding your organization and what their acceptance for risk is. And one of my favorite stories is, our executive leadership really has our back from a security perspective, and they lead by example. So what we'll do occasionally is if an executive is traveling over to, say, Europe to family vacation or whatever it may be, we may open up specific countries to allow them to, you want to check your mail because we secure the mobile device, how we're doing that. That's a different talk. But how we're doing that, say, you can check your mail while you're over in Europe or Mexico for the time frame you're over there. However, we have certain countries where like China, we're never going to allow traffic to or from China. And so I remember, a little bit of heart palpitation that I had is I found out that our CEO is going to be traveling to China because he had some activity he had for one of his boards that he's on. I'm like, So I scheduled a meeting to talk with him, and again, like I said, executives leading by example. So I had my speech all prepared, and I started talking to him about nation-state sponsored hacking, how China takes industrial espionage to a whole new level, and he just kind of stopped me and said, it's not worth putting our data at risk. He's like, I'm not going to take any Walmart equipment with me when I go travel over to China, and I won't try and access any systems while I'm over there. And if, for the activity I'm going over there, if they need any, activity I need to do, they'll provide me with it, and I'll use it for that, but I'll never try to access any of our equipment. I'm like, well, all right. It makes it easy, when they're leading by example to say, setting that tone for then their peers and their direct reports because, they're leading. DNS blackholing, again, not super complex items, but leveraging what you control, looking at who's making requests. Because as you know, in the OSI model, as I'm starting to reach out, one of the first things, I'm not saying a hacker isn't going to go directly to an IP address, and I'm not saying hackers are inherently lazy, but again, a lot of these toolkits that they're using to break into your organization, they're just re-leveraging frameworks, and so it's going to try and call typically a known CNC domain. There's no reason why your DNS server shouldn't go, no, you're going to go over here while we then react to that back into interrupting the adversary to find out what system is then having a problem. And most of your DNS servers nowadays, even if you're using like embedded stuff, whether in like your F5s or maybe have the stuff that you can just either check on for low or no cost, or there's free solutions you can implement that kind of piggyback into your DNS system. But now, if obstruction isn't enough and you want to start getting into saying, well, I've done all I can over here, or I can't make these specific, like I can't block country codes, what else can I do? This is where cyber deception comes in. And if you're like me, sometimes you kind of have to restrain yourself because you can really go off to an extreme on how you're implementing these technologies. And I promised some of my friends in the intelligence community I would talk about what a real deception campaign is, because it used to be, I had slides of, this is deception on the cheap or deception on how you can do this. And they're like, since we borrow a lot of concepts from like military intelligence or, they're like, no, this is, you're doing it a disservice about talking about through cyber deception. So this is what it can be. I mean, really getting into what your mission is going to be, what you're going to set up, how you're going to be doing it, what the analysis is, what your attack surface is going to be. And then once you start getting into deploying like deception technologies, like the THINKST canaries or different things, I mean, how you're going to do that, how you're going to orchestrate it, and how it's going to sit in your network. And you can make some very fancy diagrams. But at the end of the day, realistically, to be effective in cyber deception, it's finding out something, again, that should never be touched. And my personal example I like to use, and feel free to leverage this in your own environments, is third-party risk. It's one of those things that everyone's trying to figure out, like, I've locked down my organization, what can I do? That's just, I can't stop this, supply chain over here. We just rely on them, and they've got one guy who runs their security shop, their IT shop, and he's hardly responsive when I try and call him. What can I do? Because they have a lot of our data. So one of the things I'd like to do is leverage your key assets, which is your security resources, your people, your peers in this room. They mentioned earlier on, the SecDSM Slack channel is phenomenal. Back into, you really are cultivating, what the core of what we need in the security to combat these, the threats together. We are all in the cyber war, as a community, help each other out. And that's what's happening out in the Slack channel. And this is why I like to do these types of talks, is how do we help each other out? I mean, this isn't like secret sauce, but things you may be able to go, I didn't think about it this way, but this would be easy for us to implement. So I should have also mentioned, not only to be highly caffeinated, but I get distracted easy, so I go on tangents. So I'll circle back to one of the things that we found of, well, what do I control? Well, I know that these third-party providers or like these people that need to come into us that necessarily don't have a dedicated security staff, they're going to access my web resources. Well, they've already agreed to our privacy statements, and they already are expecting to get a security cookie from us because we're going to authenticate them into our site. So kind of what's to stop me from giving them an additional cookie that they're going to get? Now, the fun thing is the user never sees any sort of this authentication cookie because they log in our website, they do their business, they log out. And so the existence of this other authentication token or cookie on their system doesn't matter. Where this does come into play is think about understanding what you understand with the adversaries. So an attacker compromises the system. They're going to typically exhaust the resources there and say, what do I have access to? What credentials are on this machine? What tokens do I have? Before they start expanding out to see where else they can start going. So if you think from the attacker perspective, okay, I compromise this machine, which I'm not allowed to put an intrusion detection system on, and the attacker themselves is going to turn into the intrusion detection system for me because they go, oh, look, I've got all these authentication tokens, and now I'm going to go try and see what this can access to see if, oh, yeah, cool, this is a healthcare provider. Maybe I can start selling this PHI. So they use this web access token that goes to a specific machine that was randomly generated just for this particular use case. So from our avenue, I get to see that, oh, this provider has an issue, and without having to really do a whole lot of extraneous effort on our end, and again, without having to really do something that, expect them to have a large security department to implement some complex technology or threat sharing information with our organization. So something that is a high fidelity alert that we can establish. Now, do I know how they got compromised or, well, depending on what we're doing with threat intelligence, you can maybe gather those bits of metadata from what you're gleaning from the adversary. But at the end of the day, I mean, they just leverage what you can to detect them earlier on so that, yes, that's not going to stop that provider from getting breached, but back into, we're a mutual company, we're owned by our members, so what we're doing to protect our organization, we can now, do what's the effectiveness to help minimize that damage and then reach out knowing which provider got compromised to help them hopefully, kick out the threat or get the right resources involved. And again, depending upon your environment, this may be easier or harder to do depending upon what you can do. So I would challenge you to think about your business model and what you do and how your users interact, and start finding things and start thinking, okay, great, like a red team exercise. Now, how about someone who doesn't know your organization? What they try to do, leveraging the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and say, okay, if they come in during these types of ways, what might be the next step? And then looking for those next steps, and maybe putting some deception technologies there to leverage that or alert or act on that. Because some of these high fidelity ones that you go that, the only way this is ever going to be hit is going to be by a malicious attacker. Eric Johnson, I know a while back, does a lot of AppSec. He's presented SecDSM, and I know he did a presentation at SecDSM of this very type of a concept where he had a web application firewall that said, if I see this, I'm just going to fail ban this in the Amazon WAF. So that way, yeah, you just don't get to access my resources when you prove yourself to be a bad actor for a certain period of time. And then eventually, lets the IP through. And is that perfect? No. But back to interrupting the adversary. You do this enough times, and again, you may not be dealing with an individual on the other end of it, or if it is an individual and you start cutting their connection, very predictably, they're thinking, okay, they're on to me. Chances are they are most likely not going to then try to keep coming through your network because you're not fingerprinting them, and maybe you reached out to the FBI, and they're going to be trying to figure out what's going on within that organization. And not saying your go-to is the FBI. I like the FBI and all, but they're typically working on human trafficking, and so they're not going to like, hey, yeah, I've got this guy banging on my door. What help me out? They're not going to respond. So help yourself. And some of these things that you can start doing, like API, cookies. Like we're starting to migrate pretty heavily into AWS. So we started putting, certain API keys out in the space that no one should go, in certain repos that no one should access. But if they do, those lead back to certain alarms that we have that we can take action on. I talked about DNS and leveraging what's free. Microsoft's Advanced Threat Analytics, or ATA, you can tie in. If you're a Microsoft shop, a lot of people use them. It makes it, I think it's free still. And like the pass the hash or some of the golden ticket attacks, some of these things, I'm not saying it's going to be perfect, but again, back into those layer defenses, if someone's trying to take advantage of, like your Kerberos ticketing. If you have some budget and backing, some of the ones I liked, you got Maze Runner, Smokestring, the THINKST canaries. I like them so much personally. This is not something we use in our organization, but I would recommend, just because it's easy to implement and they're fairly inexpensive. They're essentially deception in a box. So if you look at how can I quickly leverage resources in my environment, there's some great open source tools like I put on with some of the earlier slides. But if you don't have a whole lot of time and spending a couple $100, you can implement these. And I believe they maybe even at some point did like a giveaway at SecDSM. Because I remember I was talking to some folks and they come across some free giveaway ones at one point in time. And then a lot of my conversations get into, I'll say, a little bit of doom and gloom when you start talking about adversary space, but you really can get into kind of winning over time. So I had mentioned within our organization, and I don't want to say anything's not hackable, but it's about, again, creating those layers. So I mentioned layer 8, or the user layer. We do what you can from a security awareness perspective, but some of these phishing campaigns that people are doing, and one of the talks that we're going to give at SecDSM, it was going to be kind of this talk, but I wanted to lay some groundwork first, is doing phishing on the cheap at enterprise scale and like AWS through full orchestration and automation. So leveraging, if you want to hey, we don't have a lot of resources to do like phishing for the organization, but I want to show some metrics to the board or figure out kind of where we're vulnerable. We'll give you the code on how to do it, how to orchestrate it using open source technology, and I think our run costs, buying the rogue domain that we use for phishing, and all the AWS run costs, if you don't have the free tier, was something like $30. So when you're phishing a organization of like 3-some thousand people for $30, I mean, it's invaluable data that you can get going back. And you can do this in, name your cloud provider. It doesn't have to be AWS, but the technologies that will give you can leverage in your technology of choice, or you can do it on premise if you want. But When it gets into what user is going to click on something, some attachment is going to get through, where our most likely attack vector is going to be, one of the things back into talking to our executive leadership, one of the things that we kind of came to, I think it was like 7 or 9 years ago, we said, we are losing the fight on the endpoint. This is that nonstop cat and mouse game of trying to keep up with the hackers. And unfortunately, Microsoft is doing us no favors of just certain things that are super hard to secure if someone has a full desktop. So we stepped back from that and said, well, can we flip the script a little bit and maybe change up the game? So we were like, how about if we started leveraging Citrix, and not like Citrix desktops, but like streamed applications. And what happens if we made that non-persistent to where a user doesn't have a desktop? I just get a series of applications I can click on. So I run Word over here, I run Internet Explorer over here, and the Internet Explorer silo that we have, it can access the internet, but the Word silo can't, and the two silos can't talk to each other. So we can start layering if all of a sudden the IE silo is trying to talk to other stuff outside of there, that there may be an issue, making those non-persistent. What can we do to start layering in these controls? And then how do we make this beneficial to the business? So finding key partners in the business that we could work with. And we started, for us, our CSAs, or claim service folks. They typically have a high degree of turnover, people on the phone, and so it used to take a long time for them to get a desktop built. And by the time a lot of times these people got out of training, they may go, yeah, this is not for me, I'm out of here. So now they're rinse repeating the cycle, and so they had a lot of heartburn around getting those desktops built and getting those applications in a timely fashion. And then this CSA's desktop would be different than this CSA's desktop, and training would be not as consistent. So we said, let's leverage this opportunity. So we started in that area and said, we can help you out. We're going to create an environment to where everyone's behavior is the same. They don't really have a desktop. They can't really customize it. No one in the environment has any sort of privilege. It's all user stuff. And then your training would be consistent, and we can give this to you instantly. So the instant that Sally starts, she can have access as she gets through training, everything's there to go. And started moving that through the organization and then saying, okay, cool, we made a lot of inroads there. Again, the environment is non-persistent, so heaven forbid something happens, you reboot the environment and then it reverts back to its golden image. I mean, it really can help reduce that dwell time. And then we said, well, how can we make that even better? Well, we don't need to have those servers up all the time. Why don't we reboot them on a cycle? So we start looking at, take the most complex nation-state adversary. And you typically have the argument of they're going to do one of two things. Either they're going to compromise the system and go low and slow and try and avoid detection, or they're going to go fast and loud, like when you think like ransomware, and how can I get the bang for my buck before you can stop me? Well, in the environment that we built out, you can really punish both of those very, very quickly. They go low and slow. You've got maybe 3 days to get off the system before you're summarily kicked off when the box gets rebooted anyway. So hard to keep a foothold there. You go fast and loud, you're going to be tripping off all sorts of sensors, any of the adversary obstruction that we've implemented, and you can automate getting the artifacts you need from a forensic standpoint, and then bouncing that system and triaging very, very, very quickly to minimize any sort of damage you might have in your environment back into automating your environment. And then measure and reporting on, hey, this is how we are making a difference, so that you can communicate. For us, we leverage NIST CSF, and we try to use like a maturity model of, I think it's Colbit, going through like maturity 3 and saying, this is how we're spending our security dollars, and this is how this is actually moving us from a 2.5 to a 3, or 3.5 to a 4, or a 2 to a 3, or whatever it may be. And so it's not just a security where, oh look, it's like a boat where I'm just hemorrhaging money over here and I just never get a return on my investment. It's like, great, we didn't get breached. Was that because I spent $3 million with you, or did you just get lucky? This helps give you quantifiable things to help, whether it's hire staff, work through, giving that information to your board, something that they can latch into and that they can understand through, what you can give them from quantifiable metrics versus qualified metrics, that they just feel secure. And then making sure that, again, back into automation wherever you can, because your time is not infinite. So how do you leverage your strengths and your expertise wherever possible? That being said, it's going to lead us into the pseudo live demo. So skip over here, and we'll go into this. So you guys may have seen the USB rubber duck, and I'm a big fan of, the thing I found is I've moved along my tenure within security. I don't get to get my hands on technology or in the weeds as much as I'd like, which is part of the reason why I really appreciate doing CTFs and like with SecTSM. And we use that when we do our cyber defense mentorship, and we've got like a CTF in a box. And so knowing that you guys are looking for CTF challenges, we're going to reach out to Brandon, to Tom, to kind of, hey, we've Dockerized all of these types of things, so you can feel free to re-leverage these, because I'm a big fan of, again, we're in this together. How do we start making, raise the level of awareness, and we can do that through these gamified systems that we've created. So for me, back to what I try to do is occasionally I find research projects where I can kind of keep my skills sharp, because day to day I'm in a lot of meetings, and so I don't get to put my hands on technology very often. So back in the day with the USB rubber duck, those of you familiar, you can load in payloads. It was a whole lot of fun. And that kind of evolved into, I like to say, the really bad USB Ninja. And this was pretty much a computer on a USB. You can start plugging payloads, fairly dynamic, and looked like a standard iPhone cable. Although I will say, unlike with the O.MG cable I'm going to show you, you could, if you're paying attention to this cable, go like, man, it is really thick on that one end, so something may be wrong. But the thing I did like is, especially when you're doing demos, production value. So I was able to make this nice USB remote trigger. So again, also not fun to fly with, by the way. You might want to leave it at home. But then you had these two buttons, A and B, and so I could pre-program these payloads into the bad USB cable, and then when it's plugged into a system, you can start triggering them and do your payloads. The problem is I couldn't really update that, and it was kind of a little bit of a pain. It wasn't as dynamic of a platform from a red teaming perspective that I would have liked. Insert the O.MG cable. So you can follow this guy on Twitter, MG out there, keep on it. He's partnered with Hack5 to sell these different cables. They have straight USB-C that eventually be USB-C that they'll be putting out. The ones that I have that will be doing this demo are, since we use a lot of Apple products, and I use a lot of Apple products, it's the Apple versions of it. And I will say, definitely make sure that you are labeling your stuff. Otherwise, this is going to go missing, and you're like, where did it go? And then you're bringing out your Wi-Fi dope scope trying to find it. Where is it plugged in at? And this is a side-by-side for a little bit better picture of what that looks like. And so this cable itself, when you're configuring it, super easy to configure. You can do a lot of customized payloads, has a lot of sample payloads, and you establish a encrypted SSID that you can then connect to. And so the demo I'm going to show you here is, since we're streaming, it's all on one page, is I had my... I should learn from my never test with your own equipment. But what you're going to see is when I was testing this on my Mac, and so you'll see my Mac desktop when I was doing this, and my phone. And then, like I said, my artistic skills are somewhat lacking, so I tried to marry up the videos as much as I could from a demo perspective. But when we do a live demo, you'll kind of see how it plays out. And then I type kind of slow, so it will be a little bit slower than what you're going to see here. So with that being said, what you're going to see is essentially I have this iPhone cable connected to my Mac, and then I connect to it with my phone, and I send it a payload, which you'll see in the screen here. And then when I go to show you the live demo, before I connect into my device, because I'm going to have to spawn a quick Python server on here, because I was not going to do my demo connected to the internet. I know better. So what I did is I've got this disconnected, so I throw up a quick Python web server here. I've got the payload hosted, and rather than curling it out on some internet website, it just fetches it from localhost. But you can see, and I'll show you the payload, and you'll get to take a look at it, and then it executes the payload. So that being said, here's what's going to happen. And it's supposed to go full screen, and it didn't. Let's go. There it goes. Okay, so what you're going to see is on the right-hand side, me connecting to the cable, and then I have a custom payload that I put in to then grab my custom payload that I wrote to then execute on my Mac. Again, would advise you not doing this on a production machine. So you'll see this gets launched. It launches terminal, launches curl, fetches my demo script, and what the demo script does is cat's SE password, does a quick LS, and then of course it would be a demo without ASCII art. So then throwing in some ASCII art for the team name we operate on for our CTF is Digital Revelation, and my handle's Oracle, so just throwing that in there fairly quickly. So that being said, I'm going to see if I can make a magic of a live demo work. Make sure I grab the right cable. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to toggle over first to show you on my phone after I clear off my notifications. So yeah, that's always fun. I should shut that off. And so that way you can see what's going on. And then we'll get back to questions. And then if you follow me on Twitter, it's not going to be super entertaining just because I use Twitter for my own reading purposes. So I follow a bunch of people and I retweet what I find interesting so I can go back and find it. Because those of you who use Twitter, I mean, I don't know if it's just me, but I find a hard time I saw something very interesting, but I was doing 10 other things at the time. So what was that again? Scroll, trying to find it. So I found if you retweet it, really easy to go into. But I'm happy to answer any questions. Email me. I've got my work email there, personal email there. That being said, we are now going to try to do the live demo. So first I got to turn my Wi-Fi back on. So for those here. And let's disconnect this. Oh, awesome. Okay. So you don't get to see my cluttered desktop. I mean, I have icons aplenty. So what I'm going to do now is make sure, I'm connected to my Wi-Fi access point that I'm going to now minimize so you guys don't mess with it. And I will connect to it. So this is the cable connection. So as you saw in the demo, this is where I can paste code, or what you'll see is aside from the signal strength, we can go down in here and load all of these example payloads. So if I scroll up, I mean, there's a fair amount of, through OS X, Linux, I mean, you name it. Again, wouldn't be fun with Windows without PowerShell and all the different ones. The one that I ran there was a modified Mac OS payload because, again, this is running against my Mac. But the cool thing with this is, say someone's borrowing your cable, and you're like, oh, wait, they have this customized desktop. You can then customize this payload on the fly to do whatever nefarious deeds you may get into. My personal favorite, swapping desktops, and there's lots of fun to be had, especially at family gatherings, so, go wild. However, I can tell you that, if your family's anything like mine, they always forget to bring their charging cables. So the hard part is these are somewhat out of stock right now, so you'll want to keep an eye on that to see when they go back into production. So now I should be connected to my Mac, and I'm going to try to create and modify this payload. So I go into here. Since I'm running PowerPoint, we'll change the delay to 2, change this to 2, and then this is where I need to enlist the help of one of my kids to type super fast. And then the demo payload, which I'll show you guys in a second. And since you saw the video, this should be very similar. And we run the payload. So now you see it's executing. And this just fired up. Delay, delay, delay. Oh, I forgot to spin up the Python web server. I'm like, oh, that's really weird. It should work. So that being said, I'll toggle over here and I'll show you this real quick. Now let's get out of PowerPoint so you can actually see my screen. Okay, so what you'll see here is it was like, hey, I launched this, and we'll get that down here. And so the curl payload failed because there was nothing for it to get. So what I'm going to do is we'll try this again real quick, but this time with less fail, hopefully. So I have a demo directory here. And in here is just one file, and if I look at this, you'll see very simply, cat ANSI password, ls, putting that to a file, making it executable, executing that file, ASCII demo. Yes. So we'll go into this demo directory again and fire up. If I can spell. But I don't want to do that yet. First, those of you who use Screen, live it, love it. Now let's try that. Aha. There we go. Now, we'll close that out of here. This time, I'll let you see it from this end, if I don't fail. So all I'm doing now is the same thing you saw me do. Load that default payload and modify it so that way it's going to curl my payload with the delays. Okay, so here we go. Now we'll see if the demo gods smile on me. Run the payload. Oh, nope, curl didn't complete. So as you see, it was a little delayed, and so it's past the RL. So again, the one thing I found back into when I said don't test on your own equipment, I found that for whatever reason on this first gen of this thing, if you keep hitting this, eventually Spotlight starts freaking out, which is something to go check in later on because it'll eventually cause a panic in this box to reboot. So, yeah, not necessarily fun, but something that we'll hit at a later date to go check into to see exactly why that's going on. But again, MG has been fairly responsive, so he's actively looking at as we get in this information of, hey, this isn't working quite right, so they'll probably fix it in a later rev. But so, rather than sit here and reboot my box, I'll see if anyone has any questions, and we'll go from there. Well, all right. I appreciate you guys coming out. If you do have any questions, feel free to reach out, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thanks.